Thank you. I think Marian really gave us some very good thought to begin with, particularly from this kind of a curatorial perspective. So let's go on to our next speaker, Graham Black. He's a professor and researcher and did a lot of research about visitor studies and particularly focusing on interpretation. So I don't want to spoil it, but really not much of technology. We want to go back to the basics. Here you are.
I'm Northern Irish, ladies and gentlemen. If you have a problem with the accent, please wave your hands. I'm used to it. Right, I feel as if I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here, going back to basics. I feel somehow that to actually return to the origins of interpretation after the talks we've had this morning seems a little bit inadequate, but I hope that it will at least stimulate some thought. I call myself an interpreter. My starting point lies in engaging the informal, non-captive, social and recreational audiences for museums who make up the vast bulk of our visitors. They come when they want, set their own agendas, do what they want, leave when they want. They're the anarchic part of the museum experience, as we've been discussing. Their museum experience is voluntary, exploratory, spontaneous, and often unintentional. I'm fascinated by the potential of using museum display to engage them deeply. I have great concerns in the current age, in that will the digital natives of today want to bring their children to visit our museums in 2030? Will they have moved on? Uwe's mention of his daughter's questions perhaps points some way towards that. In 2012, I spoke of how many people today refuse to be passive recipients of whatever governments, companies, or cultural institutions like museums offer, but instead seek to become active members of the age of participation. This is the greatest challenge, I believe, that museums face. We either develop a profoundly different, much more participative experience, one that involves creating more meaningful opportunities for engagement by our informal audiences, or we lose relevance because they go elsewhere. For me, it's through active participation that museum users gain a meaningful experience. So how can we make the 21st century museum much more participatory? And how can we persuade our informal users to take part? I want to digress a moment. This image is very deliberate. It's the excitement of the interactive exhibit. An interactive exhibit is still the single voice of the museum. The user is involved, but the museum remains in total control of the outcome. The visitor does something, the exhibit does something back, and the visitor is then expected to learn a specific piece of information. Here's a critique from the Exploratorium in San Francisco, perhaps the spiritual home of the interactive exhibit. Their investigatory activity was driven almost exclusively by the museum. They followed the label's directions about what to do, what to notice, and how to understand the experience. They rarely go beyond the museum's instructions to ask and pursue their own questions. This reflects much of the digital product in museums today, as well as more general interactives. By contrast, participant exhibits are open-ended, can involve an individual or group, are driven by the direction the user or group wants to go in, can work on different levels, and the end point is frequently outside the museum's direct control. They can vary from simple additions to the visitor experience to seriously sustained involvement. I want to mention a few non-digital ones to get you to show what you can achieve. Got to start with the urinal. This is the National Football Museum in Manchester, and it's your opportunity to score a goal. It has reduced the amount of cleaning in the gents' toilets at the museum substantially. The ABBA Museum in Stockholm, has anyone been? Yes. You walk in but dance out is the strapline. And one of your opportunities, of course, singing along. I love seating. I find seating to be the most creative means of encouraging participation. In England, you have to sit people in circles. That way they will talk to each other. If you sit them in a line, they never will. Exploring tools, especially with children, gives you a purpose behind taking children around an exhibition, and the parents are helped. They know what the kids are looking at because they're shining their torches on them. A tour of historic games from the British Museum around regional museums in England started off in Leicester, where they produced replicas of the games and put an enabler in the gallery to encourage people to play the games, tripled the length of stay. One of my favorites, Tinker Station in Pittsburgh. No design costs involved, just big tables, but people having the chance to make something themselves. You wouldn't be allowed to do some of the soldering activities here in the UK, thanks to health and safety regulations. The joys of the art trolley that goes back to the beginning of time, this beginning of art galleries. And the children who are using it take their artworks in any direction that they choose. Opportunities to contribute. This is one from Manchester Art Gallery. If you could be anywhere, where would it be? In the Moon, of course, comes into it, but opportunities for people to write and think through. It's Time We Met, mentioned by Herminia earlier. These were the two winners and became part of the advert. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art asked people to take photographs of themselves in front of their favorite exhibits and submit them, and they were used for the exhibition. I always say to museums, by the way, if the Met can allow people to take photographs in the gallery, why can't you? At Carnegie Museum of Art, they asked people to submit photographs they had taken and having been stimulated by photographs held in the gallery. Voting is always a clear-cut winner. On the left, Worcester Museum of Art in England, the curators chose their 40 favourite paintings and asked the public to vote on which was their favourite and say why, and left up the why comments, which then other members of the public responded to, taken up by the local newspaper and became a major event. On the right, just done earlier this year in Boston, Boston loves Impressionism. Van Gogh won in that case, in the vote. Moving on, because I want to stick to non-digital. This is a Dialogue Zone at the American Museum of National History. This is from the late 90s, a small exhibition on sweatshops, but using a simple opportunity to provide opinions and attitudes from different sections of the industry, and a table in the middle with further material, and then you could write your response. And again, the public were able to respond to the exhibition, but also to respond to the comments left by other members of the public. Something very close to me, there's a temporary exhibition in the Ulster Museum on the Troubles, and at the end they had an enormous space, this is just a tiny corner of it, with artworks, with newspaper articles, with books, encouraging people again to leave their responses, very, very meaningful, personal, emotional responses from both sectors of the community. And the amount of time people were held was quite enormous. An incredibly powerful exhibition. So when they did it permanently, they replaced it with this. So how to get encouraging user-generated content wrong digitally. Disaster. How you can get it right and then wrong by bringing in a computer. There you go. With all these, what all these exhibits have got in common is that they engage, they involve, they appeal directly to informal audiences. Some of them on a very gentle, shallow level, I want to be on the moon. Others much more deeply and very emotional and powerful and intellectual responses. In my view, the addition of digital technology to the museum armory can really, really represent an opportunity undreamt of by our predecessors to engage our audiences much further. The more complex the engagement sought, the greater the potential for digital, particularly when you're seeking to make visitor responses integral to content. But it's only going to work if it's devised to support participation as an integrated part of the whole. And the best way to do this, I believe, is through the application of some basic interpretive principles. And I thought I'd try and remind people of those. Today, everyone associated with museums seems to use the term interpretation, but I doubt if many of them know anything about its pedigree. The origins of interpretation as a profession lie in the environmental movement in the USA in the second half of the 19th century. John Muir, the founder of the National Park Service, really in persuading President Roosevelt to buy Yosemite, is the starting point. What we witness today in the States is based on over a century of experience of successful engagement with a recreational audience. The principles driving interpretation are therefore thoroughly tried and tested, and it's a good idea not to forget them. Number one, if I can go back. Right? Let's begin with knowing your audiences. It may surprise you, big institutions do a lot of audience research. Small institutions in the UK certainly still do virtually none. And what they do isn't much beyond basic segmentation for marketing purposes. Trying to actually get involved with how audiences engage and plan their journeys and develop their journeys through your displays is something that's rarely done. How on earth can you develop content without knowing your audiences? Number 2, 3 words sit at the heart of all the best interpretation: relate, provoke, reveal. Relate is about personal contexts. Feeling at ease in the museum is a part of that, but being able to make a personal connection with the display content through their lives, interests, experiences, knowledge. Unless visitors can make that personal context and make that link, the content is going to be irrelevant to them, or as Freeman Tilden, who invented the concept, defined it as sterile. Personal context leads to the opportunity for visitors to personalize their visit, and personalization of the museum experience is key to museum futures. What can digitization do to help that? Provocation is about intellectual engagement. Rather than telling people things, you provoke thought. How can we stimulate discussion, reflection, a desire to explore? And reveal is that wonderful aha moment when your visitor gets it, suddenly understands the meaning behind something, that generates excitement with them in a much more deep way than you can get ever from telling people something. So relate will lead to the personalization of the visitor experience. Provoke will stimulate active participation. Reveal will thrill and delight. Taken together, they'll result in that most ancient of technologies, my favorite one, which is conversation, which is what we all want from our visitors as the underpinning of meaning making. Conversation in turn supports reflection, supports a desire to contribute content because you want to share your ideas with other people. You want to read what other people have said about it. And all interpretation promotes active visitor participation. For interpreters, this begins with the mantra, people learn better when they're actively involved. 10% of what they hear, 30% of what they read, 50% of what they see, 90% of what they do. I can tell you it's freezing out there because I've done it. Yeah. If our primary ambition is then to encourage participation, the main task for our informal visitors is to persuade them to commit to taking part. And we had the question of how you get people to actually use exhibits earlier on this morning. Interpreters recommend a series of practical approaches as pathways to participation, inviting the visitors in. Making sure your environment is visitor-friendly is a hell of a good start, and there's still places that scare me. Making use of visitors' prior knowledge and interests with personal context. Recognizing each person as unique ways of processing the experience, so using a variety of approaches. Using all the senses, using questions, planning and evaluating. There's nothing in the way of rocket science here, but the application of these basic ideas are what is essential to ensure that we do what we do. And a further interpretive principle linked to doing supports a call for action. Curiosity leads to knowledge leads to understanding, and understanding in turn leads to action. There are outstanding examples of this digitally, and just to show a couple of them. Indianapolis, the Museum of Childhood in Indianapolis, The Power of Children, took the stories of Anne Frank, Ruby Bridges, and Ryan White. Ruby Bridges was bussed into an all-white school. Ryan White was a teenager with haemophilia who was given corrupted blood and caught HIV and became a poster boy for HIV. When he died, his mother gave his bedroom to the museum. He was an ordinary teenager. This was the whole point. And the 3 kids are used to show how even children can make a difference to the world. And the children who visit the museum are then invited to pledge, to make a promise about how they're going to improve the world. And that promise is put onto a computer beside the tree of promise and goes up into the tree. And the museum keeps in touch with the kid and the parents, obviously. And when the kid completes the task and emails back to the museum and goes back to the museum, the tree recognizes them, so in response. The pledge wall at the National Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. You write your pledge down and it goes up on the big screen. So ways of linking digitally to it. But the point behind both of these is that you're using exhibits, participatory exhibits, to encourage people to want to actually take action to improve the situation, to improve the world. Evaluation is also an essential part of interpretation. So how do we... Intense observation is essential. It's no use just asking questions. You have to look at how people move through what is a 3-dimensional whole body experience. The visitor moves through the galleries amongst other people, engages physically, socially, intellectually, often emotionally. So evaluation is something you have to actually seriously go into depth with. One example of it's just happened at the Natural History Museum in Vienna in London. It's actually looking at how people walk through digital exhibits there. And the key results, they found that the digital exhibit does not exist in isolation. The atmosphere of the gallery space really matters, back to what I said at the beginning, the visitor-friendly space, and influences how people use exhibits. Classic British here, people like to watch other people using the exhibits before doing it themselves. So placing the exhibit so people feel they can go and do it because they've seen others do it, and therefore they can be confident they're not going to make fools of themselves. Creating exhibits that all families can use together. This is PISEC stuff, for those of you who know that. People's hands are different sizes if they're adults or children. You need little steps for children, etc., all the basic ones. Don't fight the familiar. If people are familiar with smartphones and iPads, etc., use that technology. Ensure it takes minimum effort to figure out how to do something, so the effort can go into doing it. And people react physically as well as intellectually, sharing, explaining, expressing, competing. And the urge to touch is a powerful driver. These are really important results in terms of integrating digital exhibits into wider content, making them welcoming, unthreatening, stimulating in a way that encourages active, prolonged engagement. It's much more difficult to evaluate the impact of exhibits, and that's a process that's still going on with these ones. They have a long way to go. Just some concluding thoughts. The single voice transmission of information to a recipient audience, whether it's done by traditional means or by the most recent of digital technology, has a limited impact on people's knowledge and understanding. Developing exhibits, including digital ones, around how we know visitors behave, and basing the use of new media on long-established interpretive principles, which we know work, is much more likely to ensure that profoundly different, much more participatory visitor experience, which I called for earlier, and which the technology can promise. So, start by placing yourself in the visitor's shoes, not with the technology. Get your pathways right to encourage people to want to engage. Be participative, not interactive. And don't tell. Instead, get visitors involved, provoke thought, reveal meanings. Stimulate conversation. That's when we really know we're winning. And we really can make a difference. If you sit beside astronauts, you can end up on the moon. Thank you.